Hello, this section is discussing the Phillips curve and looking at how this alters over time. Now, just a little bit of history about the Phillips curve. It was derived by W. Phillips, and he plotted information on the unemployment rate and inflation rate over 100 years, looking at U.S. and European markets. And what he discovered was that as unemployment rose, unemployment fell, and as unemployment uh, rose, then inflation tended to fall. So he identified that there was a specific relationship between unemployment and inflation. So rising inflation means employment is falling. Falling inflation is indicating that unemployment is rising. And with this relationship, it was initially determined or decided prior to the 1960s that if the government set targets identifying an ideal inflation rate and an ideal unemployment rate, they could actually influence that unemployment just by setting an inflation rate. And for a while, they actually attempted to manage the economy by monitoring that inflation. After the 1960s, they plotted data and they realized that really they couldn't have control over what was going on with unemployment based on inflation. In other words, there was something in the Phillips curve that wasn't holding true. And essentially what's going on is that in our modern economy, business cycles and shocks to the system are occurring much more rapidly. And when these shocks or changes to the structure of the economic system occur, then the Phillips curve is affected, and it essentially shifts to a new place on the curve. So the attempts that the government had to control unemployment based on inflation really did not have the effect that they had hoped it was. In other words, they wanted an easy fix, and by golly, there was none. So that's just a little bit of history. Let's go ahead, though, and look and evaluate the theory a little bit. The first thing we want to notice is the correlation between the aggregate demand curve and the Phillips curve. First of all, on our aggregate demand curve, which is the curve on the left, we measure on our vertical price levels, and on our vertical real gross domestic product. And then our long run aggregate supply curve looks at potential GDP, that is GDP that is based on long run targets that reflect a real GDP that maintains the steady rate where there's no inflation, no employment, or in this case, a steady low in the real matter of the world, a steady low on inflation rate, which people tend to believe is about 2%, and unemployment rate that is assumed to be around 5.5% today. And then our Phillips curve, notice that on the vertical we have inflation, and on the horizontal we have the unemployment rate, and our Phillips curve is actually a downward sloping kind of a curve. We're going to be looking at kind of a bowl shape, so it curves inward. Let's see if I can get a shape in here. It would curve kind of inward, whoops, like this if we were to actually plot those, but we're not going to really worry about those right now. And in this particular example, what we're going to do is we're going to look at them as just straight lines. But this straight up curve reflects the natural rate of unemployment, and then we would plot this relationship between unemployment and inflation on these. Again, when we look at these, we're going to look at them as a straight curve. Now, what I have here is basically an example as to how people react to inflation. And essentially what happens is markets and consumers tend to ignore a 2% increase in inflation year over year. In other words, if inflation is just 2%, nobody really pays any attention to it, nobody gets upset. They just sort of anticipate that this is what's going to happen. If instead the inflation rate is between 3 and 4% or 3 and 5%, people adapt. They may move toward less expensive versions of products. They'll maybe change their spending habits a little bit over time, but they just sort of adjust and adapt. Now, if inflation increases to over 5%, then economies become unstable, consumers become annoyed, and at this point you might see governments attempting to make some adjustments. Um, and so these are basically our reactions to inflation. Keep in mind that if inflations are low and the targets right now are about 2%, we as consumers don't pay, and as laborers don't really pay any attention to changes. Um, Essentially, we ignore them. And if businesses know this, then they are somewhat at an advantage in managing their wage and labor costs in this, and also they can anticipate some pricing components. But relative to the inflation, this is not something, inflation itself is not something in the control of any businesses or the businesses in general. These are just activities that occur in the market. So let's go ahead and look at some situations looking at the market. So here we have a scenario, and we want to, in this case, kind of looking at an inflation rate of 2%. And in our current market, keep in mind that the natural rate of unemployment is about 5.5%. In the 1980s, it was 4.5%, but over time it has increased. So let's look at some of the things that might affect this. So here, what I have is a situation where inflation has fallen to 1%. And we're not quite sure why, but it has this actual impact on unemployment. And notice that as our inflation rate falls, then this pushes the long run unemployment rate out, and it could conceivably then become 6.5% or 7.5%. And things that would cause inflation to fall would be things like a growth in the population of an unskilled labor force. For instance, if young people come into the market and they haven't got college degrees and they're accepting jobs that are low wage because they don't have many skills, this is going to structurally shift the makeup of the market. And so you're going to see inflation fall and unemployment rise. Other things that might cause this to occur would be growth in the power of unions, government support to workers, or even if we put in legal barriers to firing. And these are some of the reasons why businesses are going to attempt to argue against any new supports for unions, any new government protections or on wages, or any new regulations on protecting workers from being fired. And we see that occur quite frequently these days. And then the other thing that could cause this potentially to occur, where we're going to actually accept a higher natural rate of unemployment, would be a situation where we've just experienced so much unemployment for such a long time, we just kind of adapt to it. And in our case, Michigan in particular has experienced now 15 plus years of high unemployment. And so the natural rate of unemployment in Michigan would then logically be higher than it had been previously in historic terms. Here we see a situation where the unemployment rate has actually fallen, but notice that it is accompanied with a higher rate of inflation. So what kinds of things could create this? Well, if we have a situation where the workforce is matured and it's skilled, and the entering group of young unskilled workers is relatively low, then what we're going to see is less unemployment. We're going to see higher inflation. If unions are experiencing less power, if there's less government intervention in protecting wages, or if there are fewer regulations that bar firing, or that affect an employee's ability to work. And even overtime, if there's a situation that allows companies to take advantage of overtime more greatly, then we would see unemployment fall, inflation could rise, and then another thing that could cause this lower natural rate of unemployment would be an extended period of full employment. And then people would get used to seeing people employed, and they'd be less accepting of a higher unemployment level. Here is a situation where we are experiencing some increase in inflation. And relative to the long run natural unemployment rate of unemployment, we will initially see, with this shift in unemployment, movement up along the curve to this blue, along the blue, and then the economy is going to, in the long run, settle back to the left on where the red line now crosses the long run unemployment curve. So as inflation rises, we'll see some unemployment shifts, and then our economy will then reshift back over to our unemployment rate that is actually back at the 5.5%. In the event that we're looking at, let's see here, a situation where inflation has fallen, then again what happens is we're going to see a shift along the curve downward, and then eventually we're going to end up back over to this point where we're looking at long-run unemployment. Now, governments will act to influence the economy in order to adjust to business cycles. So what happens when we see expansionary policy? Well, if we're seeking an expansionary policy, the idea, if we have rational expectations, that is, we anticipate the activity to occur, then notice what happens is the Phillips curve itself is shifted upward, but the long-run unemployment rate does not change. If inflation, or if the policies occur without anticipation, or if the change in inflation is low enough and we're dealing with ignored or adaptive expectation, then that's going to affect movement up along the curve, and we'll see the unemployment rate being impacted. So I should probably say this is contractionary policy, not expansionary policy in this instance, because we're seeing, expansionary policy because we're seeing the unemployment rate fall. And then on this one previous, we're not seeing any particular change in the unemployment rate. But anyway, so here we see the unemployment rate eventually fall. But first we see that movement. We see the movement along the line, and unemployment rate is expected. With expected expectations, all we see is inflation rising, but no long-run change in unemployment rate. If we're looking at the short-run aggregate supply curve, or rather I should say that I can throw in this long-run aggregate supply curve, or this starts to cause some adjustments in the economy. So here, with our supply curve, if in the short run, if we see an increase in price level, notice that my inflation rises. And over time, what's going to happen is my Phillips curve, which is the downward sloping line, is going to have to readjust. And notice here, because we had this period of increased prices and higher inflation, then ultimately what's going to happen is my Phillips curve is going to shift upward. And this initial 5% increase in price levels occurs because of some shock to the system. Something has happened, in this case, to aggregate supply that forces the prices to go up. Maybe gas prices have risen, and then over the course of time, the economy then adjusts to a higher level of Phillips curves. And over the course of the last, I'd say from the 1970s and 80s forward, what happens is that within a decade, you'll see a series of Phillips curves, some higher, some lower, each one kind of shifting its whole self into based on some major economic shocks, either to supply or demand. And so what we're looking at, instead of long-run Phillips curve scenarios that are effective for maybe 100 years, we're looking at clusters within a decade, and each cluster might cover 4, 5, or 6 years. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look at the impact of inflation on wages. And so here what I have is my roll of expectations of future inflation, and employers are going to base wages on their expectations of the future. Employees will seek to gather or garnish some of that change in inflation for themselves. But as we look at our current market situation, employees don't really have too much control over this. This was cost of living allowances that kept buying power equal with inflation, was really largely more seen maybe 70s, somewhat in the 80s, but they've been dissipating, particularly since 2000, 2008. So what happens then is employers have been able to adjust and adapt and actually decrease their costs of production over time based on an expectation of inflation rates. And remember, consumers, so long and in general, will ignore low rates of inflation. So here, let's say that for whatever reason, the expected inflation rate is 5%. And we're going to assume that the real wage is indexed to 100. The inflation index is 105. And in this case, our nominal wage is 30. So what I'm going to do is to get my real wage, that is the buying power in the coming year. So let's say we're looking at 2015, and my nominal wage is $30, and my buying power is $30. What we want to know is what this is worth in 2016. So 2016 comes along, and there's been 5% inflation. So what does this mean? Well, what this means is that my wage, which hasn't been adjusted for inflation, and let's just assume that they've held steady. We know a lot of companies have frozen wages over the last few years. And what happens now is that my real buying power has fallen to 28.57. Now, of course, this is really good for the company because they are able to now get that same labor at a lower resource cost. And this is helpful particularly during recession, when firms are struggling to stay above water. However, when we're experiencing growth, then we would expect to see inflation a little bit more. And in fact, during recession, we're actually seeing the opposite effect, where inflation could be zero or could be negative. And that could mean that if we don't change our wages are actually rising in buying power. But we have seen, except for 2009, 2010, we've seen inflation, and even our period of deflation wasn't that high. So essentially what this means for the company is that if they are experiencing, okay, so this is our impact at a 5% inflation, and this is expected. Now, what happens if the inflation rate is 2% instead of 5%? I work this out, and my wages have only fallen in value, buying power, to 29.41. Recall, at 5%, the wage to the employer has fallen to 28.57, but at 2% inflation, the wage only fell to 29.41. And what this means is that the employer will likely have to self-adjust because they plan for that lower wage, and they may hire fewer workers. They may even lay off some workers if the impact is too striking for their firm. What happens if the inflation rate is 8%? Well, in this case, notice that the wage fell to 27.77 with that higher inflation work rate. So the employer is paying wages that are even less costly than the wages at the 5% inflation rate that they anticipated. And in this case, the firms could potentially be in a position where they could hire another worker or two. Whether or not this is a scenario that we're comfortable with, I don't know. Some people argue that we should see cost of living wages, particularly for things like unemployment. Minimum wage, perhaps for overtime rates at the level cap that identifies at what level of supervisors qualify for overtime. And I'll leave those ideas to you, but these are concerns that businesses have. I think from our personal perspective, we're fully aware of the concerns that households have. So that concludes our discussion about the Phillips curve. Have a great day.